Members of the House, please join me in welcoming former Ambassador Daniel Mulhall to the Literary and Scientific Society. Members of the House, I am incredibly proud to welcome you to what is the fifth in our LitTalk series in conversation with former Irish Ambassador to the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany and Malaysia, Daniel Mulhall. Daniel Mulhall is a former Irish diplomat who has served as ambassador to the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany and Malaysia. He was ambassador during both the first Trump and the subsequent Biden administrations. Since his retirement in 2022, he has worked as a consultant with a global law firm and as a director of an animation production company. Daniel is also a Global Distinguished Professor of Irish Studies at Glucksman Ireland House, New York University, Parnell Fellow at Magdalen College, Cambridge, and a Resident Fellow at the Institute of Politics, Harvard University. He also holds honorary doctorates from the University of Liverpool, Chatham University in Pittsburgh, Newman University in Philadelphia, and the Southeast Technological University in Waterford, which he seems quite enthusiastic about. Throughout Daniel's life, he has lectured and published extensively on Irish history and literature. He is the author of Ulysses, A Reader's Odyssey, published by New Island Books in 2022, and Pilgrim's Soul, W.B. Yeats and the Ireland of His Time, published by New Island Books in 2023. He is honorary president of the Yeats Society in Sligo, and whilst we were having dinner tonight, revealed that he has wrote about our founder and first president of our society, Edwin Lawrence Godkin. He has been awarded the Freedom of the City of London and of Waterford, and in September 2024 was inducted into the Irish American Hall of Fame. Daniel, it is our pleasure on behalf of the Society to welcome you here, and I would like to invite you to give your opening remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I did actually write about E.L. Godkin because some years ago I got interested in writing a book about Irish war correspondence, and obviously the first one is William Howard Russell of the Times, who reported from the Crimean War. When I started investigating the Crimean War, I came across this other Irish figure, Edwin Lawrence Godkin, and I got interested in him, and I wrote a piece about those two Irishmen who reported on the Crimean War. And then I followed Godkin's career. When I went to the United States, I picked up and started looking at his life in America, because he was what they call a mugwump. He was a kind of one of these Republicans who essentially rebelled against the Republican Party towards the end of the 19th century and ended up being responsible for electing Grover Cleveland as American president, the first Democrat to be US president after the Civil War. And Grover Cleveland has another distinction. He was the only president before Donald Trump to be elected twice to non-consecutive terms in the presidency. There you are. So I wrote a piece in the History of Ireland a few months ago about E.L. Godkin, the Irish mugwump in Gilded Age America. So there we are. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about international relations and my experience of 44 years in the Irish Foreign Service. In fact, I was 44 years, 4 months and 12 days as a member of the Department of Foreign Affairs of Ireland. And I enjoyed every single one of those days, by the way, and I'm sorry that it's behind me, but I'm now trying to reflect more on the international scene that I observed as a diplomat and that I now observe as a retired person with a bit more time to think about the issues on the international agenda. So, I'm going to turn the clock back to 1975. Why am I doing that? Because at that time I was your age, right? So that's where we are. 1975, I was finishing college. I was in my final year of my BA at University College Cork. And I'm going to think about that era, right? Richard Nixon had just been pushed out of office following the Watergate scandal. Turkey had invaded Cyprus the year before. Cyprus is still divided 70 years after that invasion. So things can have consequences that are long lasting. And Cyprus is still divided between north and south along the line that was established at that time following the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. The Vietnam War, which I was obsessed by because when I was growing up in Waterford, watching RTE television in those days, every evening you saw reports of the war in Vietnam. And so the war in Vietnam was really a big part of my youth. And the war in Vietnam came to a halt in 1975 when Saigon finally fell to the North Vietnamese and the Americans departed Saigon in a great hurry. In Northern Ireland, the 1970s was the deadliest decade of the conflict. And in 1975, 260 people lost their lives in this small piece of ground in the northern part of the island of Ireland. 1975 was also the year when the Helsinki Accords were signed. That was the first effort to sort of create a dialogue between East and West to bridge the divide that had perpetuated the Cold War. It was the first time when really the two sides came together and they tried to work out a framework within which they could develop more peaceful dialogue between the Warsaw Pact on the one hand and NATO on the other. And it started a dialogue between East and West, which eventually I was involved in the organization or in the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe about 10 years later. In fact, a little more than 10 years. I was there from 1987 to 89. And at that time, you could see that the Warsaw Pact was crumbling. Gorbachev had come into power and everything was changing. And a lot of the Warsaw Pact countries were beginning to distance themselves from the Soviet Union and try to create their own relations with the European Union. So, much has changed in the past 50 years, I need to tell you, because a lot of you are probably very well read in the history of the last half century. So the Cold War is no more. Now, when I was your age, by the way, in 1975, if you had asked me how long more the Cold War will last, I would have said forever. Because there was no indication at that time that there was going to be any change. You know, the Warsaw Pact, communism was well entrenched in Eastern Europe, and there was very little resistance, really. Resistance came in the late 70s, maybe with the Polish, with solidarity in Poland, and then some movements in the Czech Republic and elsewhere, but essentially it looked like a pretty stable division of Europe along Cold War lines between East and West. But in some ways, the end of the Cold War makes the world a more complex place and not a less complex one. So we now live in what the political scientists call a multipolar world, which means that global affairs are no longer defined by the bilateral rivalry that characterized the Cold War. So, in a way, the Cold War kept the world relatively stable because the two sides sort of cancelled each other out, and the wars that happened didn't happen in Europe because the war in Europe would have been too dangerous. It would have led to a global catastrophe and a nuclear confrontation. The wars that were fought in the periphery, Vietnam and Korea and then Afghanistan and so forth, and of course the Middle East. So now we have countries like China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Pakistan, all of which are major countries with huge populations and increasingly important players on the international stage. So I remember when the Berlin Wall came down. In fact, I remember I was in Sofia in Bulgaria for a conference of the CSE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. We had an economic conference in Sofia, and I was part of the Irish delegation. And I remember one day, in those days, we didn't have Google, we didn't have anything like that. So what we had was, there was a teleprinter. It was a writer's teleprinter that churned out news all the time. But it was physical, it came out reels. And you would go, I remember as a young diplomat, you would go to the teleprompter and you would tear off the reel and you would cut it up into different, and you would put it on a peg, and then people could come and read the material on their part of the world. So if you were dealing with Asia, you would read the writer's copy that was coming in from Asia about Asia and so on. So I remember seeing this story of Reuters saying that Erich Honecker, the chairman of the East German Communist Party, had resigned. And I saw one of my German colleagues. I said, "Come over here, look at this." He grabbed the thing, he snapped it from me, and raced back to his ambassador to reveal the news that the East German leader had resigned. And shortly after that, the wall came down. So now I think after the wall came down, there was a lot of complacency, I think. And there was a sense, particularly with the Americans, there was a kind of a we won mentality. I think an opportunity was missed to bring the Russians into the fold. Now, I don't know whether it would have been possible to bridge the gap between Russia and Western Europe, but I feel that a bigger effort ought to have been made to create some kind of structure in Europe in which the Russians could have been part. But the problem was the Americans were quite, they were quite triumphant at that stage, and they really felt that they had won the Cold War, and the Russians had lost it. And in Europe, you had a lot of countries who were then about to join the European Union who were very, very hostile to Russia because they had bad experiences. You can imagine the Baltic states, Poland, Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on. They were all really hostile to Russia. Countries in the West were a little more open to better relations. So, that dog didn't bark. We never managed to get a proper relationship with Russia. And now we have a situation all those years later when we have the first serious war in Europe since 1945. And this has really shaken Europe, I think. I mean, when I was in Germany, in fact, when I was in America, I remember once having a conversation with Trump's chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, good Irish American, Michael Patrick Mulvaney. And Mick said to me, "Why don't the Germans spend more money on defense?" And I said, "Mick," I said, "don't go there." I said, "because if the Germans suddenly double their defense budget, the whole of Europe would start to quake." Now that's happened. The Germans have increased their defense spending dramatically. And nobody cares anymore because we need that, because the Russian threat is now so great that it's removed all those qualms about additional spending, additional military spending by Germany. So I think that there's every chance that we'll see a European defence entity developing in the coming years, because I think Europeans now realise that the Americans are no longer 100% reliable when it comes to the security of Europe. That Europe really has to look after itself more and more. And that, of course, poses problems for Ireland, because if we were to join a common defence, we'd have to have a referendum, and a referendum would be very tricky for Ireland, I believe, because the public are very strongly in favour of neutrality. They may not understand it fully, but they're very passionate about it, and it would be very difficult to overcome those passions about neutrality and the need to avoid involvement in military crisis. So, in a way, the biggest change that happened during my career in the Foreign Service happened here in this city, because I was here in April 1998 for the conclusion of the Good Friday Agreement as part of the Irish government delegation at that time. I was just saying to some of your colleagues earlier that I left Belfast that evening as part of a military convoy which roared its way through the streets of Belfast and out to Aldergrove Airport, because I didn't make the first plane back to Dublin after the end of the talks. I was on the second plane, which meant that it was quite late by the time we got back to Dublin, and it was quite an interesting experience to be travelling with this armed convoy through the streets of Belfast and then out all the way to Aldergrove. And when we got to Dublin, the crowd from the first plane was still there, and they were celebrating the big achievement that was the Good Friday Agreement. And by the way, all of you are beneficiaries of that agreement. Whether you are from Northern Ireland or not doesn't matter. If you're not from Northern Ireland, you probably wouldn't be here if there was still a conflict going on. Your parents probably wouldn't allow you to come here. But now you can come here. This is a normal society now, and long may it stay that way, is what I would say. So the future is not to be foretold. I mean, you were part of the cohort board after the Good Friday Agreement, and you probably have to look at the history books to remember how bad it was. I remember how bad it was, because one of my jobs was as press spokesman for the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin, and in those months before the signature of the ceasefires in '94, and even afterwards, most evenings I would get a call, especially when the ceasefire broke down. That's right, in '96. I was then press spokesman for the Department of Foreign Affairs. I'd get a call from the department saying someone's been killed in Northern Ireland, you have to issue a statement. And I would then go to my computer and I would write a statement. I did this 3 or 4 times a week for months on end. It's a very dispiriting experience, because you would try to find ways of condemning things that have been condemned every single day for years past. So I'm glad that my successors in the Department of Foreign Affairs do not have to do that kind of thing anymore. That sort of thing doesn't happen these days. But it happened a lot during my career. I'd have to sit down, put pen to paper, 10 o'clock at night, issue a statement condemning the latest killing in Northern Ireland. So you're fortunate to live in a society that doesn't have to deal with those issues. Now, the future is not guaranteed. It needs to be created. And the task of my generation was to end the conflict and find a political formula that could underpin peace in this part of Ireland. Your generation has a responsibility to find a way forward for this society. There are options available, but none will satisfy all tastes. My main hope is to see Northern Ireland prosper. The future will be easier to manage if the context is one of general economic well-being. If you have economic deprivation, it's more likely, I think, to sow the seeds of future conflict. This place needs, in my view, calm, measured conversations about the future of this society. Now, the EU has turned out to be a game changer for Ireland. I mean, I remember the referendum in 1973 when we decided to join the European Union. I still remember the arguments from that time. And the arguments were the same as they are now. We're giving away our sovereignty. We're going to be dragged into a military alliance. We're going to end up having our boys sent off to foreign wars. 50 years never happened. Those were illusions that people perpetrated, and they're still doing it. I still see saying, "Oh, we don't want to have our children being sent off to foreign wars." My response is always to say, "Give me an example of a foreign war in the last 75 years that any European has been forced to go and fight in." NATO was only once got involved in a war, properly speaking. That was in Afghanistan, which is an American war that NATO joined in order to express solidarity with America. So I think that at the EU, EU has really been a game changer, because Membership, first of all, decreased our dependence on the United Kingdom as a market, as a partner, enabled us to have a more mature relationship with the UK. And that helped, by the way, in the peace process. Because I remember every time I went to a European Council, which is where the heads of government meet every few months, there would always be a bilateral meeting, no matter what. Now, it might not be more than 15 minutes, where the two heads of government would sit down together in a room with a few officials, and they would talk about the issues that were on the agenda at that time. So the European Union provided a place where the two governments could talk to each other without a fanfare. If you have a summit meeting, everyone gets excited what's going to happen. And then when it doesn't happen, there's a disappointment. Because they met within the confines of the European Council meetings, those meetings were lower key, and therefore could be more productive in many ways. And it's certainly true that politicians on both sides got to know each other. I mean, Albert Reynolds and John Major, they weren't exactly kindred spirits, but they became quite friendly because they met each other at European finance ministers' meetings. And then, unexpectedly, both of them became heads of government. And they then had a responsibility for dealing with Northern Ireland as heads of government. I remember when Albert Reynolds died, John Major rang me and he was genuinely saddened by Albert's death, even though you wouldn't have thought they were kindred spirits as such, but they became friends. And that's a rare enough thing in politics. People talk about friendship, but they're usually much more transactional affairs rather than proper friendship. But in that case, there was a genuine rapport between the two of them, based on their experience of being together for a number of years as Chancellor and Finance Minister at European Finance Ministers' meetings. So, the EU is at a crossroads at the moment. It has problems internally. The economy of the European Union is not exactly dynamic compared with the United States. You've got issues about immigration, which are really having an effect on and galvanizing some of the more Eurosceptic parties of the far right. You have a number of governments now, Hungary and Slovakia in particular, that are very much out of the mainstream and are quite difficult for the other member states to deal with, because the EU requires political consensus to move forward. And then, of course, we have political changes in America, and these are having seismic effects. And no countries are more exposed to US developments than Ireland and the UK. The UK has a special relationship with the United States. Ireland has a unique set of ties based on historical links to the people that emigrated to the United States and settled there and contributed to making America great. And then contemporary connections based on the extraordinary flows of trade and investment between the two countries. So Ireland is really exposed to the tensions that are now developing between the United States and the European Union, because we are the European country with the closest, the EU country with the closest ties to the United States, and therefore we're most exposed to future difficulties between the EU and the US. The Middle East was in turmoil when I was your age. The Yom Kippur War, after all, took place in October 1973, and there's still turmoil in the Middle East. But things have changed, and Israel is now more powerful than it was in previous decades, and it has reached an understanding with its Arab neighbours. During the first Trump administration, when I was there, they managed to create these Abraham Accords between Israel and a number of Arab countries. Extraordinary thing to see happening, given that those countries had been previously dedicated to eliminating Israel from the face of the earth. And that has gone on, and I think I wouldn't be surprised if at some point Saudi Arabia does some kind of deal with Israel, which would be an extraordinary development, because Saudi Arabia is more worried about Iran than it is about Israel. So, strangely, there's more agitation about Gaza in Europe than there is in the Arab world. When do you see massive demonstrations in Cairo or in Amman or anywhere in the Arab world about Gaza? You see them in Dublin, in London, all across Europe. You don't see them in the Arab world. So that part of the world has definitely changed, but the divide between Israel and its neighbours has not gone away and probably never will go away. So here's my final thought before I answer your questions. That is that the world is now in a pretty difficult condition. I always like to quote literature because I was a literature and history major, and I used to quote Yeats, and about things fall apart, the centre cannot hold, Mirage is loosed upon the world. Everywhere the blood-dimmed tide is loose, the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passion and intensity. And I used to quote James Joyce, Leopold Bloom, when he was being attacked for being a Jewish Irishman. He said, "Force, hatred, history, all that is no life for a man or a woman, when it's the opposite of that that's really life. Love, I mean the opposite of hatred." But these days, I'm more inclined to quote the playwright Sean O'Casey in the final scene of his great play Juno and the Paycock, where Captain Boyle, who's not a captain by the way, he simply travelled on a ferry from Dublin to Liverpool once. When he came back, he called himself captain and nobody challenged him. Passenger on an apartment, according to the play. But Captain Boyle, anyway, is a man. He comes in to the house, roaring drunk, and he's singing a song, "Ireland sober is Ireland free," which is rather ironic given his condition. And then he says, "I'll tell you what, Joxer, the whole world's in a terrible state of chassis." And it strikes me that that's where we are at the moment. And obviously chassis is a kind of a mispronunciation of chaos. But actually chassis seems to me to be more relevant in this case, because chaos you can kind of get your head around. There's a chaos theory. But at the moment we seem to be in a world where everything is messed up. Everything is upside down. Everything is in a bit of a mess. And I'm afraid it's up to you guys to sort it out. And all I would say to you is that never give up, right? Because I remember my colleagues in Foreign Affairs, back when I joined in 1978, I remember them in those days going to Belfast for meetings, and nothing ever happened. It was failure after failure after failure after failure. And eventually, in the 1990s, it all came together. So I suppose that brings me to another quotation from a great Irish writer, Samuel Beckett. And he talked about fail, fail again, fail better. And diplomacy is all about never giving up, keeping the faith in the possibility of a solution being found somewhere down the line, even if things look dire as they do at the moment. So the pendulum will swing. The United States will never go back to where it was under Obama, but there will be a swing back to a more collegial approach to international affairs. Vladimir Putin won't be there forever. Benjamin Netanyahu won't be Prime Minister of Israel forever. So things move on, and they don't always move on in a bad direction. Sometimes good things happen as well as bad. So your job is to try to maximize the good and minimize the bad. Over to you. Thank you very much.
If you'd like to take a seat. Unfortunately, we're not just going to audience questions just yet.
Oh, that's fine. Whatever. I'm happy to hear your questions first.
I have a few for you. You've done a lot in your career. Of course, you mentioned you joined the BFA in 1978, and you mentioned that decade specifically was tumultuous. There was so much going on.
Yeah.
Was there anything, any events, any things that you might have seen on TV, that you might have read growing up, that really influenced you to go into diplomacy, to really go into that sphere of profession?
I mean, I was the first member of my family ever to go to university. That's a rarity now, but in those days that was the norm, because university education in Ireland just became more widely available at the time when I was finishing secondary school. So I was the first member of my family ever to go to university. So no member of my family had ever been in the civil service either. So for me, I thought about myself as being a teacher, because my only role models when I was growing up were the teachers that taught me at school in Waterford. So when I went to college, I then realized that, yeah, maybe teaching was not the only way I could go, and I started thinking about an academic career. And in fact, I had scholarships to go to the Australian National University in Canberra. I had a scholarship to go to Cambridge to study there. And then a friend of mine said to me one day, "Dan, look at this ad in the papers. They're looking for young diplomats. This is you." And I said, "No." I said, I don't know any languages. I didn't even know what diplomacy was. But this guy twisted my arm and made me fill in the forms, which I did. And I was called and he wasn't. And I got the job and he didn't. Well, we ended up being friends afterwards. He got a job in the Ministry of Finance, so he was fine too. But I ended up getting a job that I didn't really expect to get, and probably I would have preferred his job to the one that I got, because I hadn't had any great enthusiasm for traveling at that stage. But once I joined, you know, you go to coffee in the morning, you meet guys who come back from postings, and you hear stories about their postings, and you start to think, yeah, this might be a job that I could actually quite enjoy. So I suppose, I mean, I mentioned the Vietnam War. For me, that was a really big thing. Now, you know, it's not that didn't make me want to be a diplomat by any means, but it was an education. I remember my father explaining the domino theory to me. Do you all know the domino theory? The idea at that time was that if Vietnam fell, communism would sweep across Asia and would eventually be in Waterford in double quick time. And that's a bit of a caricature, but I mean that was the kind of general idea that you had to fight that war in Vietnam to stop communism from taking over the world. So for me that was formative in that my father, who wasn't well educated, but he read the newspaper every day cover to cover, and he listened to the news at lunchtime and watched the TV news in the evening as like it was a religious observance, right? So there was a lot of, in my house, at least to my father, there was a lot of interest in what was going on in the world. And that was probably my formative influence, really, was just that there was an interest in politics in the house, even though they weren't, my father was vaguely involved, but they weren't sort of people who didn't read the Irish Times, they read the Irish press. They watched RTE. But there was one of the things about those days is that probably at that time, most people in the country read one of the three newspapers. Irish Times, Examiner, Irish Press, depending on what kind of level you were at. And most people probably watched the 9 o'clock news on television. And most people watched the Late Late Show. These days there's no particular event on television that everyone is involved with. So that's a different world really from the one we have today. The one we have today is much more, I think one of the big challenges for the future is to kind of have some kind of common space where people can rely on the information available to them in that space. Because I was friendly in Washington with Donny O'Sullivan, who's a Kerry guy who works for CNN. And Donny covers QAnon for CNN, and he covers like the wilder elements in the conspiracy theory world. I noticed that whenever you see Donny on television, he always says to people, "I'm CNN." They go, "Oh, but I'm Irish." "Oh, that's fine, we love Ireland." Right? So all these people are Irish Americans as it happens, the basic ones included. And Donny would say to someone, they'd say something outlandish. He would say, "Well, how do you know that?" And they'd say, "It's all over the internet." And what that means is it's on the two websites that they're on all the time, which could be run by conspiracy theorists or quacks or whatever, but that's where they get their information from. There's none of that kind of common space where people get their information that's reasonably, I'm not saying that RTE was a brilliant news service, but at least the journalists there were trying to report things as they were, rather than inventing mad theories.
And do you think people nowadays are more politically educated, maybe compared to back then?
Yes and no. People, I still feel that there was a basic political education in those days that maybe might be lacking now. People were, I don't know, they follow stuff maybe in a different way. Now, of course, people have information available to them that we could never have dreamed of in those days. But the problem is the quality of that information is not always what it ought to be. And I worry about the way in which there's no longer that common space where people can come to get information that's reliable and can be sort of regarded as a consensual corpus of information. I worry about that.
You started in the economics division back in 1978. Your career has seen you in Edinburgh, Vienna, India, the United States, and the list really goes on. Was there anything, maybe a trend or something that you noticed about the influence of Ireland on a global stage? Was there something that perhaps was very unique?
Yeah, I mean, when I first went to India in 1980, the Raj had only been gone for 30 years, right? 30 and a bit years. So there were still people around from the Raj who remember the Raj. And those people tended to be very conscious of Ireland because they saw Ireland as a kind of a model for their struggle for independence from the empire. And for example, I was friendly with this young woman in Delhi. Her name was Geeta Sehgal, and her grandmother was a former Indian diplomat, but more importantly, she was the sister of the first Indian Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, Pandit Nehru. And I went for lunch one day at my friend's grandmother's place, and around the table, she said to me, "Oh, you're Irish?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "I will rise and go now and go to Innisfree and a small cabin built there of clay and wattles made. 9 beamos will I have there, a hive for the honeybee, and live alone in the Bilal glade. I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There are midnights all a glimmer and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. When I stand on the roadway, on the pavement grey, I hear it in the deep heart's core." I said, "Mrs. Pandit," she went on then to recite "When you were old and grey." She said to me, I said to her, "Mrs. Pandit, where did you learn that?" She said, "When we were interned by the British in the 1930s. And Yeats was a nationalist, and therefore we loved his poetry, and we learned that poetry, and we've never forgotten it. And the whole family around the table all joined in, they all knew the poems." I remember thinking, yeah, that's when I decided to learn that poem by heart. I said, if Mrs. Pandit can learn it, I can learn it too. So, and I met a lot of people like that, you know, who would tell you how they were influenced or how they looked to Ireland as a groundbreaker for the kind of decolonization process that they were part of in the 1940s. So that was an eye opener for me. But then when I went back to Asia in the 2000s, at that stage it was all about software and Ireland's economic miracle. So we had gone from being this kind of anti-colonial poster boy to being a poster boy for rapid economic development, and people were really keen to know how we had done this. And that was the interest in Ireland, rather than the historical thing. It was all about our contemporary achievements and how we had gone from being this kind of predominantly agricultural country to being this predominantly tech-dominated economy. So that was a big change in the way in which Ireland was viewed at that time.
And I think we can get on to the economic side of the diplomacy later. If I just want to touch upon your time as the ambassador to Britain.
Yeah.
Of course, that time coincided with Brexit.
It did.
What was your immediate strategic assessment of Brexit? What did you think the impact was going to be on Ireland? Of course, the position of the Irish government was against Brexit.
Look,
how do you view it impacted the relationship?
I thought it would be worse than it has been. A lot worse, right? So, when the referendum was called, I decided that I had a job to do. And whereas other ambassadors took a vow of silence, I decided the vow of silence would not be appropriate for me, because I decided that Ireland had too much at stake to go silent on Brexit. So I decided that I would be active, that I would go out and about, I would talk to people, I would do radio interviews, TV interviews, I'd be on social media every day, essentially, I never said to anyone, vote Remain. But I pointed out the drawbacks of Brexit for British-Irish relations, for Northern Ireland, for the border in Ireland. And I pointed those things out. People didn't want to listen, to be quite honest. But I did feel I had a duty to talk about those things, and especially for the benefit of the Irish in Britain, because there were like 600,000 Irish people who had votes in the referendum. So I felt I had an obligation to remind them that this referendum was important for their homeland as well, and that they should at least take account of the Irish dimension to this Brexit referendum. So I honestly thought Brexit would be much worse for us, because I underestimated the extent to which our European partners would be willing to support us. I feared that eventually they would decide that they had to, do a deal with Britain, and that we had to simply, take a hit for the team. That never happened. They actually were the European partners were very solid in their support for Ireland. And I think I give them great credit for that, because I know the British government believed that they would be able to drive a wedge between the members of the EU, and they would be able to appeal to those countries that had trading interests with Britain, and to sort of put aside the Irish concerns. That never happened. So fair play to the people involved who stood by us in a big way.
Sure.
And I think to their great credit.
We look back at that time and we see somewhat of a dip in relations between the governments, of course, Leo Varadkar and the successive Tory governments. What was your working day to day with the Foreign Office and perhaps the government? Was it hospitable? Was it?
Never. There was never a problem really. I was there, in a way. I was there in the good days, because I was there for a year. I was there the 3 years before the referendum and a year after. But that first year after the referendum was kind of like shadow boxing. It was kind of like they were dancing around each other. There was no really the hard negotiations started after I left. So I didn't really experience the tougher end of things. That was my successor that had to deal with that. In my time, there was very little targeting of Ireland. But after a certain stage, Ireland became the kind of bogey country for some of the Brexiteers who felt that we were standing in the way of their version of Brexit being achieved. So I had good relations with everyone, really. I mean, I was fortunate that the secretary, or the permanent secretary of the FCO was a friend of mine. We were ambassadors together in Berlin, so I knew him. I was pretty well gotten with the Foreign Office people. I had contacts and friends within Number 10 as well. So I never had a problem really in getting my message across, and I was quite active, and I did spend a lot of time with the Irish community as well, because remember, when you're ambassador, you have a number of jobs to do. One of them is to connect with the host country. Another is to connect with your own people in Britain, because I mean they have interests and they have rights too, and we provided a lot of support for Irish communities in Britain. And I'd say I visited every single Irish community organisation in Britain during the 4 years I spent in London. I just was out and about a lot. So I prioritised that bit of the work as well. I wasn't that interested in kind of hobnobbing with the aristocracy. I didn't feel that was really a priority for me. I was more interested in the politicians that could be helpful to us at Westminster, and the Irish community that we had responsibility for.
I'm very conscious of the city we're in today, Belfast, of course, and during that time, of course, you probably would have dealt with Northern Irish issues.
I did.
What was that like, of course, at the time that you were
depressing?
in office?
Depressing.
Sure.
A lot of the time, yeah.
Sure. Well, we had the Stormont House Agreement, and of course, Fresh Start, the RHI scandal and such.
Yeah.
Did those things crop up much for you? Were they on an agenda at all?
Well, I mean, like, I was here, as I said, for the Good Friday Agreement. I was here for the year or so before that with the Foreign Minister, Dick Spring, and then David Andrews latterly. So I came here a lot. But, I mean, it was a very strange time, as I think I mentioned to some of you earlier. We would land at the city airport on the Monday morning. we'd be taken by a then RUC motorcade to Castle Buildings. We'd spend the day there, then we'd be taken on a motorcade back to Mary Hill, where the Irish representation was located, and there were additional rooms there for visitors. We would stay in those rooms, and then the following day we'd go back again that evening, and so forth. So we were in Belfast for maybe 3 or 4 days of the week, but never saw anything in Belfast other than the road between the airport and Castle Buildings. So it was a very strange time. After I left, I mean, when I was in London, the attitude to Northern Ireland was really, that's done deal. None of the things you mentioned happened during my time in Northern Ireland. That is in London. It was all done. In my time, it was more, the institutions were not operating for a long time during my tenure in London. So I didn't really have a huge amount of work to do on Northern Ireland as such. I mean, I kept in contact with the Northern Ireland office. I kept in contact with opposition spokespersons on Northern Ireland. I kept in contact with the Northern Ireland Committee. I spoke before that committee many times. But it was kind of, the attitude in London at that time was that Northern Ireland, that's all done, that's all finished. And I found that interesting, because I think I knew that there was a lot of stuff going on that needed to be managed, but there was sort of a sense in London that, well, you know, that's all done. Good Friday Agreement sorted everything, next business sort of thing. So I think Northern Ireland does suffer from a bit of neglect, or benign neglect really, because in Britain it's only a problem when it's a problem. You know, it's not an issue when it's not a problem. And for the moment, at least the last number of years, happily, because you know it's good to live in boring times. You know,
That's true. It's
much better off living in boring times than living in, you know. I mean, I know journalists up here were in the middle of everything. They were global figures for years, but that was because there was terrible things happening here. I think they're much better off to have a quiet life here and to be a little bit, you know, provincial and cut off from the mainstream of things. No harm in that. Sort things out here, and then, you know, benefit from the normal run of things that now is apparent in Belfast. I come here now, it's like a regular European city, really, and that's good. That's very good. I'm thrilled at that. I remember once, I'm from Waterford, as I mentioned, and I've had 2 nieces now living here. One is still living here, the other one has moved on, but she probably will come back. She has a boyfriend from up here, so she probably will come back here at some point. She loves it here. So does my nieces here at the moment. But I remember once, a few years ago, on our family WhatsApp, I saw a photograph of my 2 85-year-old aunts having a cocktail at the Crown Bar. I remember thinking, that's the kind of Ireland I want to live in. That's the kind of place that we had all those meetings to try and bring about. That's the thing worth celebrating. These 2 elderly ladies from Waterford take the train up to Belfast and have a cocktail in the Crown Bar with their niece, who's now living and working in Belfast.
Going from perhaps one normal society to your time as the ambassador under Trump's first term.
All right.
What was that experience like? Of course, you were a very prominent figure in that, and
yeah, I mean,
you know, he was a somewhat of a difficult character to
yeah.
deal with for some. How did you find him? How did you find
I thought him
administration?
fine. I thought him fine, to be honest with you. I mean, he's a different sort of president now. He's much more active now, much more aggressive really now than he was in those days. In those days, I think he was floundering a bit. I don't think he understood fully what the president was all about. He was new to. Remember, this is a guy that had never been involved in any public life at all. Like, there had never been a president in the history of America with zero background. I mean, people sometimes refer back to Andrew Jackson in the early 19th century. Jackson had been a general in the War of 1812. He'd been a politician. He'd been a governor in Tennessee, where he was from. So, you know, he was an experienced character compared with Trump. Had never done anything other than run a property company in New York and been a TV celebrity. So understandably, the guy was a bit at sea when it came to being president. But I found it, look, diplomacy, you don't have to, like these days, no diplomat has access to the president on a daily basis. No way. Even the British ambassador, even Peter Mandelson, we shouldn't mention it, but I did get away with it. Even he, you know, it was this idea that he would be this great. I don't think Trump would have known who he was. Honestly, I don't think Trump would have, because he wouldn't have been someone that Trump would ever have been aware of. I mean, much more likely to be aware of some celebrity. You know, Trump is a celebrity guy. He doesn't, like, Mandelson's boring for Trump, but, you know, by Trump's standards, he's boring. So I never thought that Mandelson was a particularly astute appointment, because I didn't feel that he would necessarily be able to relate to Trump particularly well. And I think Trump probably didn't really know who he was, or didn't have much idea who he was. He knew he was the ambassador, but that was that. So, but he was someone you could deal with him. You know, I mean, I remember once I was down in Mar-a-Lago, and I met him down there, and he was like very friendly to me, and he asked him about something. He said, "Oh yeah," he said. I said, I mentioned a senator, and he said, "Oh, I'll give him a call for you tonight," you know. I said, and then he went away and sat down at his table in the middle of the restaurant. We were on the kind of terrace, and he was coming back an hour later. He told me, he said, I'll talk to him for you tonight. So he remembered it. So there's a certain kind of some kind of charm to him, you know. But you wouldn't want to get in the wrong side of him. You know, my British counterpart at the time, Kim Darroch, ended up having to leave America because Trump turned against him. Because some report he wrote was leaked to the media, and Trump heard about it and turned against him. But you know, anytime I ever met him, he's perfectly pleasant, and you know, he's in good form and so on. So he's kind of he's a sort of a TV kind of celebrity, and he likes to be liked, and he likes to like people as well. So that's why when people say to me, "Oh, the Taoiseach shouldn't go for St. Patrick's Day," I say, "Bonkers, has to go," because it's a chance to sit in front of Trump. If you sat in front of Trump now, you could convince him of certain things, and he would go away thinking, "You're right," because he's really influenced by what he hears. Because with Trump, all politics is personal. It's a personal thing with him. He probably doesn't read, you know, lengthy documents. He doesn't study his briefs, but he talks to people, and he likes to connect with people. And he likes people to like him. He likes to like them. And that's why it's important to build these personal relationships with him.
In an Irish Times article last year, you said that President Trump enjoys an unmatched and unchallenged degree of authority, and you spoke of how in this term his advisors seem to have less sway over him.
Yeah.
There seems to be less, at least in his mind, obstacles in his way to get his agenda done. With Micheál Martin going to the White House in just a few weeks, what would you be saying to him, representing Ireland?
I would say the same as I said last year. Like, this man, you know, you're his counterpart. If you get on with him, if there's a problem in the future, you can pick up that phone and call him. And you need to get on that level with him. You need to get on the level with Trump where you can pick up the phone in a few months' time, and he remembers you, and he has a positive attitude towards you. That's the key thing. Because, as I say, everything with Trump is personal. And we haven't really been targeted yet. But if we were targeted, and we thought it was unfair, the Taoiseach needs to be able to pick up that phone and ring him and say, "Mr. President, why are you doing this?" And explain our position to him. And that's why you have to go and meet him. If you boycott him, you're going to gain nothing and lose a lot. I mean, I remember talking to him at Mar-a-Lago, and he said to me, I passed on the regards of Leo Varadkar, who was then the Taoiseach. He said, "Thanks, I like Leo, he's a great guy." Now, most people, knowing those two, would not see them as kindred spirits. But for Trump, you know, this guy had come to his office and said nice things about him, and he liked him. And that was valuable to us, because he's less likely to do something negative to Ireland if he knows Micheál Martin or whoever it is his Taoiseach at the time. So I think it's important to deal with him one-to-one, to try and win him over. I would say invite him over to Doonbeg for the Irish Open Golf this year. I know could be difficult because there'll be protests and so on, but you know, Doonbeg, you can keep people away from it. You won't see the protests really. and he can go away thinking everyone in Ireland loves him. But then the problem is if he goes on the golf course and people boo him, then that wouldn't be the best. But hopefully that wouldn't happen. So yeah, I mean, look, you have to do whatever. Look, America's a powerful country. We're a small country, so they don't have to cozy up to us. We have to cozy up to them. We have to do everything we can to try and keep them on side with us, because we're vulnerable in all sorts of ways. But so far, we've been fine. Like, tariffs were imposed, our exports have increased. Our investment in Ireland last year was higher than ever before. So, you know, investment and trade, both of those things haven't suffered in the way you might have expected. So, I think we just have to kind of manage the next 3 years. People say to me, oh, it's a terrible year in America with Trump. I said, no. We don't decide, the playing field is not set by us. We don't decide who's American president. We have to deal with whoever it is ends up in the Oval Office. We have to manage them. And different countries are doing different things. You know, Keir Starmer delivered this letter from the King inviting him for a state visit and won him over in that way. Others have done different things. You know, the Germans gave him a birth cert for his grandfather. Framed birth cert for his grandfather. So they all try different things, you know.
It is often said that the best way to get on his side is to feed his ego. You know, we all know that he has narcissistic traits.
Yeah.
Do you think that's true? Do you think we should be?
I don't. I'm wary of diagnosing people. I think it's. I mean, he's a very unique individual who has managed to do something that nobody thought could be done. I mean, whoever thought that someone with no qualifications for the job could become US president? It just doesn't. It doesn't compute with the history of the presidency, where everyone in the past has been a seasoned politician, with very few exceptions.
You touched on it there about Ireland's influence abroad. We're often touted to have a global influence, and that's diaspora and many other reasons. Is that something that you did find to be true?
Oh yeah.
Or is that possibly touted more?
No, I mean, look, we shouldn't exaggerate this, but I mean, there are 30 million or so Americans who identify as Irish. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that they believe they were born in Ireland. Of course they don't. In many cases, they're descended from people who went to America in the 19th century, for God's sake. But they still feel an affinity with our country. That's important. I mean, let me give you an example. Just before COVID, I went out to the Emerald Society of the Tidewater, Norfolk, Virginia, where the original settlements were. And it's the Emerald Society, and all these people, most of them I'd say are 3rd, 4th, 5th generation Irish. They were so proud of their Irish heritage, loved it. The woman that picked me up at the station and drove me to the function that I was speaking at, on her mirror, dangling from her mirror, she had her Irish National Library card. And I said, what's this? She said, this is the only official document I'm entitled to display my Irish identity. I actually took a photograph of it. I sent it to the National Library president, or the National Library head, saying, look at what your National Library cards are doing. Look at the good work they're doing here in Norfolk, Virginia. But that person, she wanted to identify with Ireland, wasn't entitled to a passport, so got a National Library card. Goes to Ireland every year, spends a few months in Ireland every year, loves it, runs this society in Norfolk, Virginia. And they have their Patrick's Day events and all these things going on. Wonderful people. So, I mean, we shouldn't scoff at that. You know, we should, a lot of Irish people go, oh, it's very cringy. Yeah, maybe so, but these people are, we wouldn't be independent the way we became independent had it not been for the Irish Americans in the 1920s. It's scaring the London government that they would really make life impossible for them in America. You know, the peace process mightn't have succeeded the way it did without Bill Clinton weighing in. That was because of Irish America. Even Brexit could have been a disaster for us had it not been for the influence of Irish Americans. Even Trump in the first term never took the part of the British. He sort of stayed out of it. He didn't plough in favour of Ireland either, but he didn't take any kind of position that was awkward for us. So we're lucky to have these people on our side, and we should cherish them, and we shouldn't be too critical of them. I mean, a lot of Irish Americans, if you're offended when they come here and say they're Irish, people say, you're not Irish. They are Irish in the sense that they're Irish American, and it's part of their identity. And when Irish Americans say I'm Irish, they mean I'm an Irish American. It's shorthand for Irish American. So Mike will say I'm Irish, Irish Joe from Scranton. I remember meeting Joe's sister once, Valerie, who said to me, we're just Irish Catholics. That's our identity. That's who we are. And that will always be the same with us. The Biden family are Irish Catholics. That's it. That's an identity that's quite strong. A lot of people have it. And it benefits us. No other country has an annual jamboree like we have every year in March for St. Patrick's Day. The Swedish St. Patrick's Day, and we have as many people in our diaspora here as you have. I said, yeah, but they don't identify with you because they didn't keep the connection with Sweden going. There are a few people up in Minnesota maybe who wear a kind of Swedish costume every year for whatever, but there's no real community there, whereas there is an Irish American community in a big way. And it's still a reality. Like the Ancient Order of Hibernians, they still have 100,000 members or thereabouts.
And just one final question before we do open up to the audience. What would your advice be to aspiring diplomats, those who do want to go into the career that you have spent so long in, those who do want to perhaps shape affairs on a global stage?
I would say get some experience outside diplomacy and join in your late 20s. You have a little bit of ammunition built up. Because these days, most of the colleagues who are coming in now are in their late 20s. When I joined, we were mostly in our early 20s. You had to be, you couldn't join after 25. I think it's quite important to do other things and have a bit more to your resume than just straight from college into the foreign service. Because if I were on an interview board now and you turn up before me, I wouldn't be that interested in your academic achievements. I would assume that you had the academic ability to do the job, that you could write a report and that you could, you'd be able to read and analyze things going on in the country you're posted to. What I would be asking myself is, okay, this young man, if he got posted to Sierra Leone and suddenly there was an outbreak of Ebola, how would he cope? Or if he was posted to Swaziland or not to Mozambique, and the ambassador got sick and had to go home, and he was in charge of the embassy. Could I trust him to run the place? Would he be able to do it? Would he just kind of fold? If I sent him to, I don't know, to somewhere in Asia, would he be able to cope with the life of, being so far away from home and family? So I think we'd be judging more maturity and more rounded personality, because you don't want the most brilliant international affairs academic. You want a person that can do a job for you, and the job is to represent the country in the round. That's not a job that can be assessed purely on the basis of academic accomplishments. So you're looking at your character and the qualities you have other than the academic resume.
I think that's a lot to chew on. If we do have any questions, please do put your hands up. Yes, sir, come on.
So you talked a lot about, you mentioned how there's these rising right-wing anti-immigration sentiments.
Yeah.
And in the summer there past, we saw a lot of trouble on both north and south over that. Would you have any advice for somebody, just like an ordinary person on the street, let's say, who values the peace here and wants to preserve it, but isn't
Values what?
Values like the peace here,
Oh, yeah.
and wants to preserve it, but they maybe feel they're just like an ordinary person. Like what could they do?
Well, look, I mean, on the issue of immigration, I think that it's been a gift for the far-right parties. They've been able to capitalize on the fact that immigration is not easy to resolve. If people turn up at your border, what do you do with them? If people come across in boats from France to England, do you sink the boats in the channel? Do you kill them all? No, you can't do that. That would not be acceptable. in a civilized country like Britain, or in Ireland, or anywhere in Europe, really. So, look, I always say about immigration that in Ireland there are four aspects to it. There are EU nationals and UK nationals who have a right to live and work in Ireland as part of the European Union and the Common Travel Area. First category. Second category are people who have visas because we need their skills, and we bring them in to provide the skill sets we need to drive our economy. And the third group are asylum seekers, who are entitled to claim asylum. Now, in my view, we should be able to process their cases more rapidly. It shouldn't take us 3 years to do an assessment of whether they're entitled to asylum or not. And then the fourth you have is the category of people who maybe just arrive illegally and they have no rights at all. In my view, they can be just expelled. But by far the biggest number of people is in the first two categories, the first two categories. It's those who have a right to live in Ireland, the UK or EU citizens, and those that we need to give visas to because we need their skill sets. And you have a lot of Indian, someone told me recently that the most prosperous demographic now in Ireland is Indian women, because they're usually young and single, they have good jobs in tech, they're earning good salaries, and they have very high, income levels. And that's because we're bringing in highly skilled people. We're not bringing in people to sweep the streets, by and large. We're bringing in people with high skill sets. And, when I see people say, we're going to be replaced by people from outside the country, I say nonsense. I say, give me an example of any country where there has been a replacement of the native population by foreigners, by people coming in, other than through conquest. Even conquest doesn't always replace. The Norman conquest didn't replace the population of Britain. They were simply a new ruling class were established. That was it. The same was true with Ireland. When the Normans came to Ireland, the native population remained the majority population. So there's a lot of nonsense spoken, and people tend to confuse all these things and put them in together, and they claim that most of the immigrants are male asylum seekers. They're not. Most of the immigrants into Ireland are from the European Union, from the UK, or they're people with high skill sets that we need to drive our economy forward. In terms of what you can do, look, it's easy to be overwhelmed and say, oh my God, I can't do anything, it's hopeless. No. I remember during the financial crisis in Germany, when I was there as ambassador, it was overwhelming. Like every day there was bad news coming from home about the economy and so on. It was a terrible time, really. I remember saying to my staff, we can't solve Ireland's crisis. We can only do one thing. We can run the best embassy there can be for Ireland and Germany for the next 3 years. That's our job. You can only do the job that you have available to you. You can't change the world, but you can do the things that are within your reach. And you should do those things, and you should do what you can, because every little bit does count in the end. But if you sort of, I think the worst thing you could do is to despair, to feel it's hopeless. It's never hopeless. There's always things you can do. You always have agency, no matter who you are, and how modest your situation in life may be. You can cast a vote, for example. Yes.
We have one. Yes, just there in the blue top.
Hi. I'm touching on, you spoke about your father and how he was in the news, even with the lack of political education. I'm from Donegal myself, and there's a dwindling number of people in Ireland now that are keeping up with not only the news but politically educating themselves, particularly in our education system itself. Politics as a legal subject isn't widely outside of Dublin. What would you say about kind of reforming our education system to make sure that young people are staying in touch and educating themselves on politics?
Yeah, like when I was at school, there was a thing called civics. I'm sure it's long gone.
So we have SPHE, which does have civics in it. However, you do that in your first year.
Yeah.
And by the time you get to obviously 6th year and you can vote, that's well gone. Do you know what I mean? You don't have that in the forefront of your mind.
If I had my way, I would, apart from, the maths, English, and in our case Irish as well, I would also have a mandatory social sciences. I don't know, you call it what you like, doesn't really matter, but something that would prepare people for the world they'll be living in. Prepare them with the skill sets to be able to decode what's happening in the world and to make sense of it. Call it what you like, but something like that I think should be mandatory, and probably a science. So I would have, the language, the mathematics, the science, and the social policy. Because I think the social policy stuff is probably neglected, and probably kids do come out of college, out of school without having the necessary ability to manage the kind of world that we now live in, with so much information around us and so much difficulty in trying to make sense of it and to put order on it in some way.
And EJ, in the back.
Yeah. You talk about kind of over the great expanse of your career, you started off with the Cold War era, kind of between USSR and America, then seeing Ireland as we take our place in this more multipolar space. You were also within this career during the rise of China, which very much developed over its time over your career. And you also did work in Malaysia. So I'm kind of wondering, especially when you talked about kind of maintaining a relationship with the US and the important relationship you have with them. How do we kind of navigate this rise that we're seeing?
That's probably one of the big challenges, really. Look, when I left Ireland in 1980 to go to India, my colleague, we were close friends and colleagues in Dublin, Paul Kavanagh, and Paul went to China, Beijing. So we said that we would visit each other. So a year later, I visited Paul in China. That was in 1981. China was like, it was so, in those days, everyone wore the kind of, the Mao suits they were called, these uniforms. You'd walk down the street in Peking, it was called those days, Beijing, and people would stop you and ask to have a photograph taken with you, because a foreigner was so unusual to see in China. There was what they call the friendship store, where you could buy foreign goods. That was only open to diplomats and the members of the hierarchy of the Communist Party. So it was, and I went back again when I was ambassador in Malaysia in 2002, and the place had been transformed 100%, and I'm sure it's even more extraordinary now. Going back today, I probably would be bewildered. I was Shanghai about 15 years ago, and that was an extraordinary experience as well, to see Shanghai, this incredible place that makes New York look like kind of a second-rate city. So yeah, and I also believe India is now a really serious country. I might not like the way Modi operates, but India has a vigorous democracy nonetheless, and yet the last election, Modi got a bit of a kicking, probably taught him a lesson. It will never happen in China because they won't allow it. But so I think in Europe we can't afford to become an annex to the White House and the Pentagon. We have to have our own ability to do things for ourselves. And one of the big challenges will be, can we somehow find a way of relating to the United States as our traditional ally, and also have a reasonable relationship with China. That may be difficult to achieve, but I think we have to try. If we don't try, then we are relegating ourselves to the third division status, and that's not what we should be looking to do.
And perhaps one last question, Jack.
Oh, I'm happy to take all questions. Go ahead, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for your contribution. It's almost 30 years since the Downing Street Declaration, where the UK commits to ceasing any selfish interests in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
which culminates with the cessation of Operation Banner in 1987, basically the removal of formal military structures in Northern Ireland. Almost 30 years on, do you think it's time that we review closing the back door on one of the largest security loopholes in the northwest compound of Britain's / Ireland's security complex, when you look at how underfunded, under-equipped, and it's essentially altogether deprived the of Ireland's defence forces are, especially with Russia in 2022 reorienting its doctrine to putting more naval resources around the Arctic and Atlantic. Do you think it's time that we maybe look at how we can work together to bolster defence between the two nations?
100%. I mean, I couldn't agree more with you. In fact, I saw a story in the Irish Times today that we're now developing a new maritime strategy, and we're going to work with France and the UK to develop this strategy. I mean, look, unfortunately, neutrality has been successful for Ireland. We've managed to. Because look, I take the view that you should spend as little as you can on defence and as much as you need to. And frankly, we got away with spending a pittance because we were remote from the cutting edge of the conflict between East and West, and we were able to sit in our hands and believe that we were doing the noble thing by being a neutral country. That word has changed for two reasons. One is that Russia has now become a renewed threat to Europe that it wasn't for 20 years after the end of the Cold War. Russia was was in turmoil. Now it's become quite an aggressive power again, and there's a real risk that it could try to encroach on. It wouldn't be difficult for the Russians to stir up problems in Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, where there are Russian minorities and so forth. So we've got to be stronger. And I think, and then the second reason is that the nature of warfare has changed. It's no longer, we're not going to be invaded, right? There would be no point in invading Ireland if you were Russian. But there would be a point in attacking our infrastructure. There would be a point in knocking out a lot of our data centers that are storing. There would be a point in severing the undersea cables. There would be a point in sending drones around to stop our airspace from being used by other forces. So there's a lot of stuff that could happen there that's way short of invasion, but it's even more. It's more destructive than invasion, because it would cause more trouble. You wouldn't have to do very much. Send a few drones up around Dublin Airport. You could close Dublin Airport for a day, and that would sort of be a huge economic blow to our country. So I think there's a realization that has to stop. So I take the view, look, let's just commit to spending 1% of GDP on defence. That would mean a quadrupling of defence expenditure. Now, it's not easy to do that because, it takes time to, but I think we need to do that. That's roughly what Austria spends on defence. Austria is now committed to going to 2%, but if we get to 1%, then I think we would be at least showing that we are serious about our defence, and that we should also be willing to cooperate with our neighbours. Regardless of neutrality, neutrality is a kind of it's irrelevant really. We're not going to join a military alliance, I don't believe. There's no military alliance to join at the moment anyway. If there were to be a European defence organisation, we'd have to have a referendum to join. That could be a problem. I don't know how we would get a referendum passed in Ireland, but it doesn't matter. We can do a lot without being a member of an alliance. We can simply work with our partners to make sure that we achieve the goals that we see as important and they see as important too. So yeah, I mean, I've written a piece about this, which I'll probably publish in the next few days. I'm making the case for just taking defence seriously, and this triple lock that we have is a complete nonsense, and it doesn't really matter, because you could be a member of NATO and still have a triple lock, but I mean, it's just so ridiculous, and it makes us look like not a serious country, that we have to get approval from the Security Council to send our troops abroad. I mean, what mature country does that kind of thing? But this is all part of this kind of effort on the part of elements to undermine the institutions of the state, to basically say, we don't trust our government, we don't trust our parliament, even though we elect them. These are people who are not really signed up to the system we have. They want a different kind of system, and they're using this neutrality argument to try and stir people up. And they've succeeded. to a large degree, and this will be a real problem for us if there is to be a European defence entity, which I think is possible, not certain, but possible. We will have a real problem in getting approval from the Irish Republic to join. So that's why I'm saying, let's not go down that road. Let's focus on what we can do while remaining neutral.
Henry, in the back.
Yeah, so just to preface, like, this question is by no means a kind of one to, put pressure or criticize, but genuinely one of curiosity. So in countries like, take examples of Malaysia, take China, take the US. So in Malaysia, you have a system, as you would know, of racial supremacy, where Malays get special property rights and discrimination against Indian and Han Chinese minorities is prevalent. You'll know in China that there's internment that breaches international law covenants of weaker minorities in Xinjiang. And I do not think I need to describe problems in relation to US conduct and human rights abuses. Now, I don't say it in a sense of how do morally reconcile or total balance of abetting such countries, but genuinely, from a very limited power that you have in a diplomatic setting, how are such conversations managed? How are such factors included in discussion? How is Irish influence used and wider diplomatic influence used productively to mitigate these problems, if at all? And if not, why not? Because at the end of the day, these are powerful countries.
Look, I think every country has to cut its cloth. You can't pretend that you can just go in and tell people what to do, because it doesn't work like that. I never had occasion to make any representations in Malaysia about these issues, because I took the view that Malaysia was a country that, broadly speaking, worked pretty well, despite the racial and religious differences and the linguistic differences as well, by the way. Malaysians tend to live together in reasonable harmony, and the country is I think, comparatively speaking, reasonably well run. And now they've gotten rid of their corrupt prime minister. It's not a perfect system by any means, but I'd always had a lot of time for Malaysia, because when you think about it, often Malaysia will ask me about Northern Ireland. We say, they're both Christian, aren't they? Yeah, they are. And they both speak the same language. Yeah, they do. And they both have, and they're both from the same race. Yeah. You kind of see them going, what is the problem? Well, why is there such a problem here? Why are we, So I say, given you've got Malay, Chinese, Indian, from the north of India and the south of India, so they're different races really, Tamils and people from North India. You've got Sinhalese, you've got all sorts of people living in Malaysia, and then you've got people of kind of mixed background who are maybe Christians, and then you've got Muslims, and you've got Buddhists, and you've got Sikhs, and so forth. I think it's a miracle that Malaysia hangs together the way it does. With China, every time the Taoiseach goes to China, there's a kind of a question in Parliament. Are you going to raise the issue of human rights in China? And the answer is always, yes, we will. And the answer is, we do. But the Chinese have now come to the point where they just listen to you and then move on. They don't really, they will maybe push back a little, but it's sort of, in a way, I think it's become pro forma, that you have to kind of make these points, but they understand that this is not, you can't do anything about it. They know that, you know that, but we go through this kind of process of at least making points about the human rights record. And that's fine. Look, I think that it's part of the European tradition to regard human rights as a priority. I mentioned the Helsinki Accords earlier in my talk, 75, East and West. And the Helsinki, the CSE, which was established by the Helsinki Accords, had three baskets. One was economic, one was security, and the third was human rights. And the Russians hated that. Like they didn't want to be discussing human rights. but the West insisted on that. They wanted to discuss security, and they were willing to discuss economic as well. They didn't want human rights. Part of the bargain was you've got to accept discussion of human rights, and that caused all sorts of problems. Like very often the meeting would be suspended for weeks on end because there wouldn't be agreement because of the clashes over human rights. So it's important to have human rights on the agenda and to keep pushing that envelope. But you have to understand as well that there's no ability on the part of a country like Ireland or even of the European Union to impose its will on other countries. So for example, there obviously are abuses of human rights in Israel at the moment, but nobody can do anything about it because we don't have the leverage over Israel. Likewise in America, I mean, the Americans now complain about certain things in Europe. We don't complain about what happens in America because we realize that would cause a big falling out between America and the European Union. We don't want that to happen. So we kind of bite our lips and keep our views to ourselves. But I'm now seeing a little more willingness on the part of Europeans to kind of argue back and not to accept some of the things. I mean, for example, yesterday, Ambassador Kushner, who's the American ambassador in France, was summoned into the Quai d'Orsay to be criticized, to be reprimanded over some comments he made about left-wing violence in France. And he refused to go. He sent his deputy. And now the foreign minister of France has banned all government ministers from talking to the ambassador. So basically they're now isolating the ambassador from contact with the French government. So there's a little more willingness now to push back against some of the things that the Americans have been doing over the last while.
Yes.
I mean, in your experience in the international field, is there a language you wish you knew going in? Are there any languages you've picked up? Is there a language you think anyone who's going to go into diplomacy should know?
No, I mean, when I first joined the service, French was really the language that people felt they needed to have, because in Brussels at that time, the interpreters went home at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. As the meeting went on beyond that time, it switched to English and French. You had to understand both languages. That's all gone now. English has become the lingua franca of the European Union, literally, across the board. Now there's still interpretation, but a lot of the work is done through English. If you go now to a meeting of foreign ministers, they all speak English. So we've gained a lot of advantages from that, to be honest with you, because it's our own language, and we're much more adept at the language than even the best English-speaking German is going to not be as good as we are in the command of English. So most places now, ambassadors can get away with English and not have to learn the local language. There are probably a few exceptions to that. France, I think, is still a place where you'd find it difficult to survive in Paris as an ambassador without having French. In Germany, no problem. Most of the ambassadors didn't have much German. I did, but most of them didn't have. I thought it was a matter of pride for me to learn German while I was there, which I did. And I was pretty good by the time I finished. And my German's gone down a hill now since then. But anyway, I still have it, more or less. Italy is another place where, I think you kind of need to have a language, and likewise Spain. But if you're in Lithuania, no one in Lithuania expects you to speak Lithuanian. No one in Poland expects you to speak Polish. No one in Hungary expects you to speak Hungarian. So, it depends on the country, really. But I'd say the European countries where it's necessary would be Italy and Spain, France, these three. Germany, no. Germany, they're very happy to speak to you in English, and most people, even obviously in the Australian exam, it's English is everyone knows English, but even in the ministry, the other ministries, you can always get people who speak pretty good English. So, and when you speak to them in German, they kind of realize quickly that your German is not as good as their English, so they speak to you.
Maybe one last question, just from LitTalk.
Hello. So you've mentioned quite a lot, obviously, you're a student of history. I think that's kind of a lifelong affair, really. And also your diplomatic experience certainly has given you a unique insight into world events. Now, I've been wondering, as a student of history and as a person with a unique insight into international affairs, was there one opportunity you feel was missed that could have reshaped the world order? Was there one key decision that was not made, or maybe a decision that was made poorly, that you believe if maybe a different way could have essentially remodeled how you work?
Good question.
I mean, I mentioned one already, which is after the Cold War ended, there should have been more of an effort made to try and bring Russia into the fold. That was an opportunity missed, I think. The other one I would say was the Oslo Accords. You know, I mean, there you had a kind of a peace in the Middle East that had been agreed, and then it didn't happen because, you know, the Palestinians couldn't or felt they couldn't stand over it. That was a missed opportunity, and then we've had like 30 years of violence since then in the Middle East, and like terrible tragedy of Gaza, which doesn't, you know, at least there's something happening now, but not very much. I mean, I'm not very optimistic about Gaza, but at least there's the killing has gone down the scale, at least, which has to be a positive thing. But the momentum in favour of any kind of political outcome that could be acceptable to the Palestinians doesn't seem to be there really. So yeah, that would be one which I think was, you know, was a miss. They'd be the two things that would occur to me, as you know, and of course, yeah, I mean, yeah, those two are I think are examples of where something could have happened, didn't happen, and we're still living with the consequences of that not happening.
I think we could all sit here and listen to Daniel all night, but unfortunately, we think people have to study and sleep, of course.
I have to sleep as well, you know.
I'd just like to give you a few dates for your societies before I invite the President back up to close the session. On March 9th, we're hosting the former President of Ireland, Mary McAleese.
Oh, wonderful.
On March 30th, we have Sam McBride, the editor of the Belfast Telegraph. On April 13th, if someone you might be quite familiar with, Peter Taylor, the former BBC journalist.
Oh yeah,
of the Troubles.
I knew him well, yeah.
And then on April 20th, we have the Speaker of the Assembly, Edwin Poots, coming to the Society.
Edwin Poots, give him my best.
I will indeed.
You remind him of Patrick's Day he spent in my company in Washington. He still remembers it, I'm sure he does.
I will pass on my regards. And of course, I'd like to thank Daniel for being here, and thank you all for being here. I'd like to give him a round of applause.
Members of the House, what we have witnessed here tonight has been a deep exploration of architecture, of tearing down walls and breaking barriers, and of building bridges and uniting houses. Such an immense wealth of knowledge and experience in history, literature and geopolitics could not be found in any lecture hall. No, my friends. But I'm sure you'll agree that after tonight, it most certainly can be found in a Mulhall. So, as a token of appreciation from our society and for your contributions to the immersive literary experience that our society offers, Daniel, I would like to add to your long list of accolades in presenting you a literary pin badge.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're very much.
And of course, thank yous are in order. I'd like to thank you all for contributing to our discussion tonight. I'd like to thank our events officer, James, for organising the event and of course convening our brilliant interview. And once again, I'd like to thank Daniel Mulhall. A massive thank you again. And I am incredibly pleased to call this meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Very good crowd as well, very good questions.